Humans deserted the Galactic Forum, Council faces the terrifying price. The seat was still warm. That was the detail that stayed with me. I, Yara Osei, former human delegate to the Galactic Forum, pressed my hand against the back of the chair at the human bench and felt residual heat from whoever had sat there last. A cup of tea, still steaming, sat beside a data pad that had not been switched off. The screen scrolled a quiet news feed from Earth. Someone had simply stood up, pushed the chair back, and walked away. 847 alien delegates filled the chamber. Not one of them spoke. The Forum Hall on Station Veral was the most impressive structure I had ever seen. It had been built over 400 years ago, designed to hold every spacefaring species in the known galaxy under one roof. The ceiling rose 200 meters above the floor, inlaid with a living map of the galaxy that pulsed softly with light. Every inhabited system glowed gold. Corridors branched off the main hall in every direction, leading to meeting rooms, translation suites, and diplomatic quarters. It smelled of recycled air and old wood paneling, because some ancient human delegate had once complained that the station felt cold, and the Forum had installed wood paneling in a gesture of goodwill that nobody ever mentioned again. The human bench seated 12. All 12 chairs were pushed back. All 12 were empty. Delegate Vor of the Salvari, who sat at the Elder Five's raised platform at the head of the hall, was the first to find words. The Salvari were among the oldest spacefaring species, blue-skinned, four-armed, with a recorded civilization stretching back 9,000 years. They carried themselves with the slow authority of people who had watched many younger species rise and stumble. Vor leaned forward across her bench, her secondary arms folded behind her back, and said in her smooth, unhurried voice, "The human delegation appears to be absent." The translation software rendered her tone as neutral. I knew from years of experience that it was not neutral. It was the tone of a teacher noting that a troublesome student had not come to class. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Sheeval, the young Keth aide stationed near the translation booth, leaned over to me and whispered, "Did they say anything to you?" I said, "No." That was the truth. As a senior diplomatic analyst, I was not part of the delegation proper. I sat in the observation gallery, 2 rows behind the main floor, alongside researchers, journalists, and junior staff from dozens of species. I had watched the human delegates file out at the lunch recess. They had not been hurried. They had not been loud. Delegate Alan Croft had finished his meal, folded his napkin, touched the shoulders of the 2 people on either side of him in what looked like a quiet farewell, and walked toward the corridor. The others followed in ones and twos. Nobody had announced anything. At the time, I thought they were going to the restroom. 20 minutes passed. Then 40. The afternoon session was called to order with the human bench still empty. Vor asked the chamber clerk to send a formal inquiry to the human diplomatic quarters. The response came back in 11 minutes, the quarters had been vacated. Personal items collected, rooms tidied, access cards left on the entry table. They were gone. The Forum's first debate of the afternoon was supposed to be about trade tariffs on mineral transport through Sector 7. Instead, the chamber spent 3 hours discussing the human absence. This was, in its own way, perfectly fitting. The humans had spent the last 2 years asking the Forum to discuss something else entirely, and the Forum had consistently preferred to talk about other things. Now the humans were the other thing. I sat in my gallery seat and listened to delegate after delegate stand and offer their interpretation. The Eraveth representative, a tall insect species with clicking mandibles, suggested that the humans had suffered some kind of internal political crisis and would return within days. The Myrith collective sent a formal expression of sympathy, presuming the humans were dealing with a tragedy. The elder delegate of the Davari, a species known for their blunt honesty, stood and said simply, "They left because we refused to listen. They will not come back until we deserve to have them back." He then sat down and said nothing more for the rest of the session. Nobody wanted to say what the real problem was. The real problem was the Vreth. The Vreth were not a species that anyone had formally met. They were a distributed, silicon substrate intelligence, meaning they did not have bodies in any way that most species could recognize. They existed as a kind of spreading signal, a coordinated pattern that moved through star systems and consumed the organic chemistry of living worlds, converting it into more of themselves. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They moved, and where they moved, biospheres ended. The first confirmed Vreth event had been reported 4 years ago in the Outer Rim, a dead world called Pelin 7 where every organic compound had been stripped from the soil and atmosphere within an estimated 3 years. Then 2 more systems. Then 5. The expansion was not fast by human standards, perhaps 1 system every 8 or 9 months, but it was consistent and it was accelerating. The human delegation had raised the Vreth at the forum 19 times. 19 formal presentations, each with updated data, each with proposed response frameworks. The Elder 5 had classified the Vreth as a navigational concern on the grounds that no confirmed intelligent life had yet been consumed. This classification meant the matter sat in a subcommittee review cycle, which meant it could be discussed but not acted upon, which meant it had been discussed, and discussed, and discussed, for 3 years. The last human presentation had been delivered by Delegate Alan Croft himself, 12 days before the walkout. He had stood at the speaker's platform for 40 minutes and laid out, in plain and careful language, that the Vreth had now been confirmed moving toward the Inner Rim. That 3 species with forum membership had systems in the projected path. That the current subcommittee review cycle would not produce an actionable resolution for another 14 months at the earliest. The chamber had voted on whether to expedite the subcommittee review. The vote was 198 against, 1 in favor. The 1 was Earth. Croft had returned to the human bench, sat down, and made a note on his data pad. I had been watching from the gallery and I remember thinking he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Now his chair was empty and still warm. By the end of that first day, the official forum position was that the human delegation had taken an unscheduled recess and would return after a period of reflection. This was the diplomatic language for, "We are not sure what happened and we are hoping it resolves itself." The Elder 5 issued a joint statement expressing their hope that Earth's delegates would rejoin the chamber at their earliest convenience. Earth did not respond. I walked back to my quarters that evening through the station's long observation corridor, where one wall was entirely transparent and looked out at the stars. The forum station orbited a dim yellow sun at the edge of a quiet system chosen specifically because it belonged to no one, a neutral space for neutral ground. The stars beyond the glass were still and cold and very old. I stopped at the window for a long time. I had worked in galactic diplomacy for 11 years. I had seen delegations walk out before, usually in protest, usually with a list of demands, usually with the clear intention of returning. Those walkouts had a particular energy to them, a heat, a kind of theatrical pressure. This was different. This felt like something closing. Not a door slamming. A door being gently, quietly, and permanently shut. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and looked at the stars. Somewhere out there, past the edge of the Inner Rim, the Vreth were moving. And the forum had just lost the only species that had ever seemed genuinely afraid of them. The silence from Earth lasted 4 days before I stopped waiting for it to end. I was not the only one waiting. The forum's entire diplomatic communications wing had been sending hourly inquiries to Earth's relay station since the walkout. They received the same automated acknowledgement each time, "Thank you for your message. The Earth Diplomatic Corps is currently engaged in priority operations and will respond at the earliest available opportunity. Your message has been logged and prioritized in the response queue." That last sentence was the part that nobody in the forum seemed to understand. The response queue. As if Earth were a busy office with too many calls coming in. As if the Galactic Forum were simply one item among many on a very long list. Delegate Vor called it, in a private session of the Elder 5, an insult dressed as administration. She was not wrong about what it felt like. She was very wrong about what it meant. I figured it out on the 4th day. I was reviewing data in my office, a small room off the observation corridor with a desk and a wall of screens, when I pulled up the latest Vreth tracking report from the Outer Rim monitoring buoys. These were automated sensor platforms that the forum had deployed 3 years ago at human insistence. The forum had agreed to the monitoring program while refusing to agree to any response program, which was the sort of compromise that satisfied everyone in the chamber and nobody in the field. The tracking report was 40 pages of telemetry data. I read it twice. Then I cross-referenced it with the shipping lane reports from the 3 forum member species whose systems sat nearest the projected Vreth path, specifically the Keth, the Myreth, and the Araveth. I was looking for anomalies. What I found instead was an absence. Human vessels had been a regular presence in those sectors for years. Survey ships, diplomatic couriers, small freight carriers running supply contracts. The last logged human transit through the Keth border sectors had been 11 days ago. Before the walkout. They had pulled their ships out before they left the forum. I sat back in my chair and looked at the ceiling. They had been planning this. Not the walkout itself, perhaps, or not only the walkout. They had been planning the work that would follow. While the forum had been discussing whether to expedite a subcommittee review, Earth had been repositioning assets. While Croft was giving his 19th presentation to a chamber that had already decided to vote no, someone on Earth was drawing up operational plans. The automated response queue was not an insult. It was a statement of fact. Earth was busy. Earth had somewhere else to be. I spent the next 6 weeks quietly collecting every piece of open-source information I could find about human activity in the outer and mid-rim sectors. I was not a spy. I had no access to classified material from any government, including Earth's. But ships leave wakes in sensor logs. Supply contracts are registered with port authorities. Personnel transfers show up in the Galactic Workforce Registry if you know where to look. What I found, piece by piece, was the outline of something enormous. 16 human deep space research vessels had been reassigned from their logged survey routes and were now moving in coordinated patterns along the Vreth expansion vectors. These were not small ships. 2 of them were the class that Earth used for long-duration xenobiological study, the kind of vessel that carried full laboratories and could spend 3 years in the field without resupply. 11 human military escorts had gone dark on their registered transponders. This was legal under Earth's own regulations during active operations, and it raised no automatic flags in the Galactic Shipping Registry. But 11 ships going dark at once, in a region that was currently the only active concern in the galaxy, was not a coincidence. A research paper appeared in the Journal of Xenobiological Physics, authored by 3 scientists from the University of Cambridge and the Beijing Institute of Advanced Resonance Theory. The paper was deeply technical, focused on the behavior of distributed silicon substrate signal patterns under various forms of electromagnetic interference. It was peer-reviewed and published without fanfare. It had 847 words. Buried in the methodology section was a reference to field data collected from what the authors described as direct observational proximity to a Vreth-adjacent environment. Direct observational proximity. Someone had been close enough to a Vreth expansion front to collect live data. That took either extraordinary courage or extraordinary preparation, and from everything I knew about the humans I had worked alongside for 11 years, it was probably both. I pulled together everything I had and wrote a private report. I did not submit it to the forum. I did not send it to the Elder Five. I sent it to one person, Delegate Sheeval of the Keth, who was not yet a delegate but was the most intelligent junior diplomat I had ever met and who had the enormous advantage of actually paying attention. I told Sheeval what I believed was happening. Earth had not walked away from the galaxy. Earth had walked away from the forum, which was a very different thing. They were doing what they had been trying to get the forum to authorize for 3 years, except now they were doing it without asking permission. They were studying the Vreth in the field. They were developing a response. They were building something. Sheeval read my report and came to my office the next morning. She sat down across from me, folded her hands, and said, "If you are right, and they succeed, they will come back." "Yes," I said. "And when they come back, they will not come back as one voice among 200. "No," I said. "They will not." Sheeval was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Should we be worried?" I thought about Croft folding his napkin. I thought about chairs pushed back from a table. I thought about the automated response queue and the 16 research ships in the paper in the Journal of Xenobiological Physics. "Not about the humans," I said. "About the Vreth, yes. Very much. But not about the humans." She nodded slowly and looked out the window at the stars. What I did not tell her, because I did not want to frighten her more than necessary, was the other thing I had found in my weeks of research. It was not a ship log or a supply contract or a scientific paper. It was a simple registration record from the Galactic Diplomatic Archive. 6 weeks before the walkout, Earth had filed a formal registration notice with the archive. It was a quiet document, the kind that gets filed and catalogued and read by almost nobody. It registered the creation of a new interspecies consultative body. The name of the body was the Compact for Galactic Security. The registered founding members were Earth and 5 smaller Forum member species who had been consistently sidelined in Elder 5 deliberations. Earth had not walked out of the Forum. Earth had walked into something else. And they had started building it before they ever left the table. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. Outside my window, the Forum station hummed with the business of 200 species debating trade tariffs and diplomatic protocols and the phrasing of resolutions that would be reviewed by subcommittees and tabled for further consideration. Somewhere in the dark beyond the rim, human ships were moving in silence toward a spreading threat that the Forum had called a navigational concern. The Vreth did not know any of this, of course. The Vreth did not know anything. They simply moved and consumed and expanded. But the expansion vectors I had studied showed one thing clearly. They were no longer moving only outward. They were curving. Slowly, steadily, with the patience of something that does not feel time, they were curving toward the systems where the oldest stars burned and the oldest civilizations lived. The Forum held a gala that week celebrating 500 years of galactic cooperation. I watched the lights of the celebration through my office window and thought about the Keth homeworld, a beautiful planet with violet seas and 3 moons, sitting directly in the projected path. I thought about how Croft had made a note on his data pad after the vote. I had never found out what the note said. I suspected it was not a complaint. I suspected it was a plan. The first distress signal from Theron 4 came in on a Tuesday, at 3 in the morning station time, and it was the sound of the signal that I remember most. Not the words. Not the data attached to it. The sound. The Keth used a tonal communication protocol for emergency broadcasts, a rising and falling series of frequencies that their species had evolved to respond to instinctively. Even processed through translation software and routed through the Forum's general communications channel, it carried something in it that made the hair on my arms rise. I was awake when it came in. I had not been sleeping well for weeks. I pulled it up on my desk screen and read the attached data first. Theron 4 was a Keth agricultural colony, population 340,000, established 2 centuries ago to supply food to the Keth homeworld. It sat at the edge of the Keth system cluster. It was the outermost Keth settlement. And its surface biosensors had just logged a full atmospheric chemistry shift consistent with early-stage Vreth conversion. The Vreth were not in the outer rim anymore. I sent an immediate alert to the Forum's night duty communications staff and then sat in my chair and waited. The response took 9 minutes. The night duty coordinator, a senior Myrith official named Essa, pulled up the same data and sent out a priority wake call to all Elder 5 representatives. Within an hour the Forum was in emergency session. I had never seen the chamber fill that fast. Delegates arrived still adjusting their formal attire, some with food in their hands, the Myrith collective sending a physical representative rather than their usual remote proxy, which told me they understood the gravity of the moment. The Keth delegation, led by Ambassador Iran, arrived last. Iran was a composed individual under most circumstances, but when she walked to the Keth bench and sat down, I saw that her hands were not steady. The Theron 4 signal was now 18 minutes old. The second signal had already arrived. This one was from the colony's orbital monitoring platform. The surface conversion was accelerating. The platform reported that the biosensor readings were consistent with full Vreth coverage reaching the colony's main population center within 72 hours. 72 hours. Delegate Vor called the session to order and said, in a voice that was still smooth but no longer unhurried, "We are facing an active Vreth incursion within Forum member territory. This body must respond immediately. I am opening the floor for emergency proposals." What followed was the most painful hour I had ever spent in that chamber. Not because of the Vreth. Because of the Forum. The Myrith collective proposed an immediate military response force assembled from voluntary contributions of each member species. This was sensible. This was exactly what should have happened 3 years ago. But the Davari representative stood and pointed out that no framework for a joint military force existed under the current Forum charter, meaning any such force would need a full charter amendment, which required a 60-day consultation period. 60 days. 3 species home systems would be consumed in 60 days. The elder delegate of the Eraveth suggested bypassing the charter amendment by classifying the response force as a temporary humanitarian convoy, which technically did not require the same approval process. This was clever. It was also 3 years too late. The Araveth should have suggested this creative interpretation of the charter when Croft was giving his first presentation, not his 19th, and certainly not after the humans had already left the table. Vor asked the chamber to vote on the humanitarian convoy classification. The vote passed 196-2. It was the fastest vote in forum history. I noted, not without a bitter twist in my chest, that this same chamber had voted 198-1 against expediting a subcommittee review 12 days before the walkout. The difference was that Theron 4 was now actively showing Vreth conversion. The difference was that the colony was Keth, and the Keth were beloved, and the Elder 5 had finally understood that this was not a navigational concern. Then the question of operational command came up. The humanitarian convoy needed someone to lead it. And here the chamber discovered, very quickly, that none of the species assembled had conducted a military operation of this scale in living memory, that the Forum had no standing command infrastructure, and that the Vreth did not fight back in any way a conventional force could engage because the Vreth were not an army. They were a spreading pattern. You could not aim a weapon at them. You could not destroy a headquarters. You could not negotiate a ceasefire. Delegate Vor looked at the data on her screen for a long moment and then said something that I had never heard her say before in 9 years of watching her work. She said, "We need help." The chamber was quiet. Everyone knew what she meant. The first communication to Earth went out from the Forum's priority channel at 4:47 in the morning. It was addressed to the human government and to the Compact for Galactic Security, whose existence the Forum had not officially acknowledged until that moment. It read, in formal galactic diplomatic language, that the Forum was facing an urgent situation and requested immediate consultation with Earth representatives. The automated response came back in seconds. "Thank you for your message. The Earth Diplomatic Corps is currently engaged in priority operations and will respond at the earliest available opportunity. Your message has been logged and prioritized in the response queue." Erin, the Keth ambassador, read the automated response on the main screen at the front of the chamber. She read it twice. Then she put her hands flat on the bench in front of her and looked straight ahead at nothing. I watched from the gallery and said nothing. Because what was there to say? The Forum had been warned. It had been warned 19 times, in formal presentations, with data, with projections, with proposals. It had voted against urgency 198-1 and then held a gala. It had classified extinction as a navigational concern and then celebrated 500 years of cooperation while a species' homeworld sat in the path of something that did not distinguish between old civilizations and new ones, beloved species and forgotten ones, Elder 5 members and single-vote outliers. The second hail to Earth went out at 5:15. The third at 6. The fourth at 7, this time personally signed by all 5 Elder delegates, which was historically unprecedented. The automated response came back each time. By mid-morning the Forum had received 22 responses from the human relay stations, all of them the same polite, infuriating message about the response queue. Theron 4 sent its last signal at 11:41. The colony's orbital platform recorded full atmospheric conversion at the surface. 340,000 Keth. A 200-year-old agricultural settlement. Violet-green fields that had fed a homeworld. The Vreth moved on. The Forum chamber was silent for a long time when the final signal came through. No speeches. No proposals. No votes. Just silence and the soft pulse of the galactic map overhead, one small system in the midrim growing dimmer as its recorded activity fell to 0. Erin sat very still at the Keth bench. I did not look away from her. I owed her that much. Then something happened that had not happened in the Forum in my 11 years of work there. The communication board lit up. Not with an automated response. With a live connection request, routed through a private secure channel, flagged with a Compact for Galactic Security transmission identifier. The duty operator looked at Vor. Vor nodded. The screen at the front of the chamber opened. It was not a human face. It was Delegate Marin of the Pelith, one of the 5 founding members of the Compact, a small species from the Midrim who had been marginalized in Forum proceedings for decades. Marin was composed. She looked directly at the camera and said, without preamble, the Compact for Galactic Security is aware of the Theron 4 situation. We have been aware of it for 6 hours. We are currently coordinating a response. We ask that the forum cease further communication attempts to compact channels during active operations. You will receive a formal invitation to attend a briefing within 48 hours. Please prepare your senior delegates for transit. The screen closed. The chamber was quiet again. Vor sat back in her chair slowly, the way a person sits when they have just understood something that changes every assumption they have been operating under. I sat in the gallery and pressed my hands together and breathed carefully and thought about Croft's empty chair and the warm cup of tea and the registration document filed quietly 6 weeks before the walkout. They had known. They had known the forum would wait too long. They had known Theron 4 was in the path. They had known the Vreth would reach forum member territory before the subcommittee finished its review cycle. They had known all of it, laid it out 19 times in that chamber, and then, when the 19th vote came back 198-1, they had stood up, pushed back their chairs, and gone to work. They did not enjoy being right. I knew that about them. I had worked alongside them for 11 years and I knew that being right about something terrible was not satisfying. It was a weight. But they had carried that weight and they had kept working. 48 hours. The Vreth were still moving. The Keth homeworld was 3 systems away from the last confirmed expansion vector. And somewhere in the dark between stars, the compact was already in motion. I arrived at the compact's forward coordination vessel before most of the forum delegates, and I am glad I did. It gave me 20 minutes to stand at the entry corridor and understand what I was looking at before anyone from the Elder 5 walked in and started performing. The vessel was called the Meridian. It was a human ship, long and angular, built for deep space operations rather than ceremony. It smelled of machine oil and recycled air and very strong coffee. The corridors were narrow and lit with practical white lighting, not the soft ambient glow of the forum station. Everything on board had a function. Nothing on board was decorative. That detail struck me immediately. Every space the forum occupied had been designed to impress. The Meridian had been designed to work. The briefing room was set up with a central table and chairs arranged in a simple ring, no raised platforms, no tiered seating, no elder bench elevated above the rest. There were cups of water and small plates of food from different species' dietary requirements, set out without fanfare. A large operational display covered one wall, showing a live map of the Vreth expansion vectors, the compact's deployed assets, and the projected timelines for each affected system. I recognized the map. It was the data from the deep space research vessels I had identified in my investigation 6 weeks earlier. What had been scattered field data was now a complete operational picture, color-coded and time-stamped and precise. At the head of the table stood a woman I recognized from the forum records. Her name was Yara Osei. She was Earth's senior diplomatic analyst, not a delegate, not a general, not a head of state. She was the person they had chosen to run this briefing, and the choice told me everything about how the compact operated. They had not sent someone impressive. They had sent someone competent. She looked up when I entered, nodded once in recognition, and went back to reviewing something on her data pad. I sat down and waited. The forum delegates arrived in groups over the next 30 minutes. The Elder 5 came last, as I had expected, and I had the satisfaction of watching Vor pause at the entrance to the briefing room and take in the equal-sized chairs with a flicker of something behind her composed expression that might have been surprise. There were no special seats. There was no head of the table. There was only the table, and the wall of data, and Osei standing in front of it with her hands clasped behind her back, waiting for the room to settle. When everyone was seated, she said, without introduction, without preamble, and without any of the formal opening rituals the forum observed as a matter of tradition, Theron 4 is gone. The Vreth expansion front has now entered the Keth cluster. At current velocity, Keth Prime has approximately 19 days before first contact. I am going to tell you what we know, what we have built, and what happens next. Then I am going to ask you some questions. Please hold your statements until I have finished. The room was very quiet. She began. For the next 40 minutes, Osei walked the assembled delegates through everything the compact had developed over the 18 months since the walkout. The data from the deep space vessels. The xenobiological analysis of the Vreth signal pattern. The theoretical framework developed by the Cambridge and Beijing teams, expanded now into a full working model. And finally, the thing she called the resonance barrier. The resonance barrier was not a weapon. This was the first thing she was careful to explain, and she explained it in plain language with no technical decoration. It did not destroy the Vreth. It disrupted their coordination signal, the frequency on which their distributed intelligence communicated and organized and directed expansion. Without that signal, the expansion front fragmented. Fragmented Vreth could not consume a biosphere because they could not coordinate the conversion process. They simply stopped. It was not permanent. The signal would re-establish itself over time if the barrier were removed. But a sustained barrier, maintained by a network of relay platforms deployed along an expansion vector, would hold the front in place indefinitely. The relay platforms had already been built. 16 of them. They had been deployed over the past 3 months by the research vessels I had tracked in my investigation. The network was not yet complete. 4 more platforms were needed to close the gap around the Keth cluster. Those 4 platforms were currently in transit. They would arrive in 11 days. Keth Prime had 19 days. There was a margin of 8 days. Osei paused after laying out the timeline and looked around the table. She was not looking for applause. She was checking whether everyone understood the numbers. Then she said, "The compact is not asking the forum's permission to deploy this barrier. The charter we filed 18 months ago gives us independent operational authority in security matters within member species territory. 3 Keth settlements, 2 Myrith colonies, and 1 Araveth outpost have already signed compact membership agreements. We have authority to operate." Vor's expression shifted. I recognized it. It was the expression of someone realizing that the conversation they thought they were having is not the conversation that is actually taking place. However, Osei continued, "There are 17 forum member species with territory in or near the projected Vreth expansion path over the next 5 years. The compact does not yet have membership agreements with all of them. Completing the barrier network to protect those systems will require access to their space. It will be faster, and it will cost fewer lives, if the forum endorses the operation and provides that access formally rather than requiring the compact to negotiate 17 individual agreements while the Vreth are in motion." She paused again. "We are offering the forum the chance to be useful," she said. "That offer is open for the remainder of this meeting." The silence that followed was one of the most charged silences I had ever sat inside. It had texture to it. It had weight. You could feel the Elder Five processing the geometry of their situation, the fact that they had not been summoned to a negotiation, they had been invited to participate in something that was already underway and would proceed with or without them. Vor said, carefully, "And if the forum were to endorse the operation, what would that endorsement entail?" Osei said, "Acceptance of the compact's operational command for the duration of the barrier deployment. Endorsement of the new Galactic Security Charter, which requires a simple majority of member species for emergency response authorization rather than Elder 5 consensus. And a formal acknowledgement in the forum record that the Vreth threat was classifiable as an existential risk 3 years ago and that the forum's classification as a navigational concern was in error." The last requirement landed in the room like something solid. Vor said, "You are asking us to formally acknowledge fault." "I am asking you to formally acknowledge a fact," Osei said. "The record should reflect what happened. Theron 4 happened. That is in the record whether you acknowledge it or not. I am asking you to be honest about why." The Araveth delegate made a sound that the translation software rendered as a quiet agreement. The Davari elder stood and said, "I will sign," and sat back down. 2 more compact founding members at the table nodded. Vor looked at Osei for a long moment. Then she looked at Irin, the Keth ambassador, who had not spoken since the briefing began and who had been sitting with her hands flat on the table the same way she had sat in the forum chamber when the Theron 4 signal went silent. Irin said, without looking up, "Sign it." Her voice was very quiet. It was the quietest voice in the room and also the only one that mattered. Vor turned back to Osei and said, "The Elder 5 will require the remainder of the day to review the charter language." Osei said, "You have until this evening. The relay teams depart at 0600 tomorrow regardless." She did not say it with heat. She did not say it with satisfaction. She said it the way you state a boarding time for a transport. It was information. It was a fact. The relay teams would depart at 0600. This was not subject to debate or amendment or subcommittee review. The Myrith Collective's physical representative raised a hand and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than accusation, "How long have you been planning this?" Osei considered the question for a moment. "We started the xenobiological research program 2 years before the walkout," she said. "We started the barrier engineering program about 8 months after Croft's first presentation to the forum. The compact charter was drafted about a year before we filed it." The Myrith representative said, "So you never believed the forum would act?" Osei said, "We believed the forum would act eventually. We were not certain that eventually would be fast enough. So we made sure it didn't need to be." I wrote that down. I wrote it down because I wanted to remember it exactly. We made sure it didn't need to be. That was the whole of it. Not anger. Not abandonment. Not a political statement or a display of frustration. A practical calculation made by people who had looked at the data and understood that the forum's timeline and the Vretha's timeline were not compatible, and had quietly, methodically, without fanfare or announcement, built a different timeline. The Elder Five signed the compact charter at 9:47 that evening. It was not unanimous at first. 2 elder species held out for additional review time. Osei granted them 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours they signed, because the alternative was watching the compact proceed without their endorsement and discovering, in the coming months, that the new galactic order had been structured without a place for them at the center. The relay teams departed at 0600 as scheduled. 11 days later, the final 4 relay platforms went live. The resonance barrier closed around the Keth cluster like a door swinging shut. The Vreth expansion front, which had been moving with the patient momentum of something that had never been stopped before, reached the barrier's edge and fragmented. It stopped. I was on the meridian when the confirmation came in. The operational display showed the expansion vectors going flat one by one as the barrier stabilized. It was quiet in the room. People were watching screens, checking data, running confirmation protocols. Nobody cheered. There was a kind of collective exhale, the sound of a held breath released, but it was not celebration. Osei stood at the display for a moment after the final confirmation registered. Then she said, quietly, to nobody in particular, "Run the maintenance check on platform 12. The signal looked slightly off on the last pass. Someone said, "Yes, already on it." And that was the moment I knew the barrier was going to hold. Not because of the data. Because of her. Because her first thought after achieving something that the entire Galactic Forum had failed to even attempt for 3 years was to check the maintenance data on Platform 12. That was who they were. That was why they had left. And that was why, sitting in the quiet operations room of the Meridian with the Vreth expansion front finally, blessedly, still on the display, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. Keth Prime was safe. 8 days to spare. I want to tell you something about the new compact table. It is round. Not oval, not rectangular, not the tiered forum structure with its elder platform raised above everyone else. Round, with seats spaced evenly, sized identically, with no head and no foot and no arrangement that suggests any participant is more central than any other. The Galactic Security Compact meets in a chamber aboard the Forum station now, because the Forum agreed to host it as part of the restructuring terms, and the Compact team spent 3 days arguing about the furniture before they settled on the round table. I know this because I was in the room during one of those arguments. I had, by then, been formally seconded to the Compact as a senior analyst, the first non-founding species member of the Compact staff, which I regarded as one of the most important things that had ever happened to me professionally. Osei told me the secondment was because of the investigation report I had sent to Sheevil 18 months earlier. She said it showed I knew how to pay attention to things that other people were not paying attention to, which was the most useful skill in the galaxy. I chose to believe her. The round table argument was settled when Osei walked into the room, looked at the 3 competing table designs laid out by the design team, and said, "The round one," and walked out. Nobody argued. Not because Osei was frightening, she was not frightening in any way that involved volume or anger, but because when she expressed a preference it was always so clearly grounded in something practical that disagreeing with it felt like disagreeing with mathematics. The round table is because no one species should sit at the head. That was the practical reason. There was another reason, quieter, that I understood from working alongside the Compact staff for the months that followed the Keth cluster operation. It was not about equality in the abstract. It was about accountability. When you sit at a round table, you can see everyone. There is no back row, no observer gallery, no junior bench where voices go to be noted and then set aside. Everyone at the compact table speaks and everyone is heard and everyone is responsible for what happens after. The forum restructuring took 4 months to finalize. I will not pretend it was smooth. The Elder Five did not surrender their traditional authority with grace. Vor in particular spent considerable energy trying to negotiate language that preserved a form of elder advisory primacy within the new charter, and Osei spent considerable energy politely declining each version. The negotiation had a quality to it that reminded me, more than once, of someone trying to convince a closed door to reopen by explaining very carefully why it should want to be open. The door did not reopen. But it was not destroyed either. The Elder Five retained permanent seats on the Compact Council, with full voting rights, equal to every other member. They simply no longer had veto authority. A simple majority of affected species could now authorize emergency response operations within 72 hours. The subcommittee review cycle still existed for non-emergency matters. It had simply been forbidden, in clear charter language that Osei drafted herself, from being applied to matters where a credible threat to inhabited biospheres was already confirmed. This was not a complicated principle. It had taken 3 years, 1 walkout, 18 months of covert preparation, a destroyed agricultural colony, and nearly a lost homeworld to establish it in writing. I thought about that often. The Keth held a memorial for Theron 4 2 months after the barrier went live. It was a small ceremony, by Keth standards. Private. They did not invite the forum. They did not invite the compact. Erin told me afterward that it was a family matter, which I understood to mean that the Theron 4 colony had been part of the Keth sense of themselves in a way that went beyond politics, beyond galactic affairs, beyond anything that a round table or a charter amendment could address. I asked if I could attend. Erin thought about it for a long moment and then said yes. I was the only non-Keth present. The ceremony took place in a garden on the forum station, a small green space that a Keth diplomat had cultivated over decades, growing plants brought from their homeworld in careful, sealed growing chambers. The plants had violet-green leaves. They swayed gently in the recycled air of the station's climate system. The Keth do not use spoken words for grief. They use harmonics, a kind of structured resonance produced by groups of voices together. I did not understand the specific meaning of what I heard. But I understood what it was. And I stood at the edge of the garden and listened to it and let myself feel the weight of what had been lost and what could not be recovered and what should have been prevented 3 years earlier by a forum that had chosen the comfort of process over the discomfort of urgency. I did not look away. I owed the Keth that much, at minimum. After the ceremony, Erin walked with me back toward the main station corridor and said, without looking at me, "Do you think they knew? The humans. Before the walkout. Did they know Theron 4 would be lost?" I had thought about this question for months. I had looked at the data. I had run the timelines forward from the point when Croft gave his first presentation. If the forum had acted then, the barrier program could have begun with full resource authorization, full interspecies cooperation, and a 2-year head start. With a 2-year head start, the barrier would have been complete before the Vreth reached Theron 4. The colony would still be there. I said, I think they knew it was likely. I think that knowledge was part of why they were so persistent. And I think that when the 19th vote came back 198 to 1, they understood that persistence in the forum was no longer the most useful thing they could do with their time. Erin was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That must have been a very difficult thing to know." "Yes," I said. "I think it was." She nodded and we walked for a while without speaking. I have held that conversation in my mind ever since, in the way you hold something fragile and important. Erin was right. It was a very difficult thing to know. To understand that the room you are in cannot move fast enough, to have shown the data and made the case and been outvoted, and then to make the decision to leave not out of defeat but out of necessity. To go and do the work that the room refused to authorize. To succeed, eventually, and to know that success came too late for Theron 4. That is not a victory. Or rather, it is a victory with a scar through the middle of it that does not fade. The compact now has 42 member species. It is larger than I expected it would be, this early. I think the speed of the growth reflects something that was waiting to exist in the galaxy for a long time. A structure that responds rather than deliberates. A table that does not have a head. A framework where smaller species have the same weight as ancient civilizations when the matter at hand is the survival of their home. The forum still exists. It handles trade disputes, diplomatic protocols, cultural exchange programs, the long bureaucratic business of a galaxy with 200 spacefaring civilizations. It does this reasonably well, and the Elder Five are still influential within it. The subcommittees still meet. The resolution language is still debated with extraordinary care. None of this is without value. Deliberation has its place. It simply does not have a place in the 72-hour window after a Vreth expansion front reaches a border. I attend both bodies now. I go to the forum sessions for trade and cultural matters, and I sit in the gallery and take notes, the same as I always did, except now my notes go into compact operational files rather than personal research logs. I go to the compact table for security matters, and I sit at the round table and vote and argue, and sometimes lose the argument and learn to accept that outcome with more grace than I would have managed 10 years ago. The Vreth expansion front remains contained within the barrier network. The relay platforms require maintenance, and the compact has built a dedicated maintenance program staffed by 4 species with complementary technical skills. The Platform 12 issue that OSE flagged on the day the barrier went live turned out to be a calibration drift in one of the secondary resonance emitters. It was corrected within 6 hours. The platform has shown no anomaly since. The barrier will require monitoring indefinitely. The Vreth are still there, on the other side of the relay network, fragmented and quiet. The compact's xenobiological team continues to study them. A second paper was published last year by the Cambridge and Beijing group, now expanded to include researchers from the Pelith, the Keth, and 3 other compact member species. The paper proposed a theoretical model for the conditions under which a Vreth signal might undergo spontaneous coherence collapse, meaning a situation where the pattern becomes unable to sustain itself even without the barrier. The model is preliminary. It requires more data. The team is working on it. I sat with OSE once, about 6 months after the barrier went live, in the small cafeteria on the Meridian during a resupply stop. We were both eating dinner alone and ended up at the same table, which happened sometimes when the ship was busy and seating was limited. We talked about ordinary things for a while, the maintenance schedule, a personnel question she was working through, a communication protocol that the Pelith delegation was requesting changes to. Then she was quiet for a moment, looking at her cup, and she said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to be honest." I said I would be. She said, "When I walked back into that forum chamber on the Meridian and gave the briefing, was it the right way to do it? Not the operation. The approach. The way we came back." I thought about it. I said, "You did not gloat." She looked up. I said, "You could have. You had earned it." The forum had ignored 19 presentations and voted 198 to 1 against urgency and held a gala while Theron 4 sat in the path. You could have walked into that room and said all of that out loud. You chose not to. She said, "It would not have helped anything." I said, "No, but most people would have done it anyway." She considered that. Then she said, "We lost Theron 4. "Yes," I said. "I go over the timeline," she said. "I think about whether there was a faster way. If we had deployed the first relay platforms 8 months earlier, if the barrier had been ready before we left the forum, Theron 4 might have been inside the network." I said, "The barrier was not ready 8 months earlier." "I know," she said. "But I think about it." I said, "That is the correct thing to think about. You should think about it. Just do not let it stop you from doing the work." She looked at me for a moment and then nodded, once, and went back to her dinner. That was the only personal conversation I ever had with her. She was not a person who sought those conversations. But she was a person who noticed when they were necessary and had them anyway. I respect that more than almost any other quality I can think of. Last week I was at the compact table for the quarterly review session. The new species membership applications were being processed. 17 more civilizations have applied since the restructuring. The review process is thorough but not slow. We have learned to be thorough and not slow, which sounds simple and is in practice a skill that requires constant discipline. At the end of the session, before the table cleared, Sheeval of the Keth, who is now a full compact delegate and one of the sharpest voices in any room she enters, asked me if I would walk with her to the observation corridor afterward. We walked in the direction of the long transparent wall and stood looking out at the stars. The forum station hummed around us with its ordinary business. Somewhere along the corridor, through a set of double doors, the forum was in session discussing shipping lane protocols. Shival said, "Do you think it will hold?" I knew she meant the barrier. But I also knew she meant more than the barrier. She meant all of it. The compact, the round table, the new charter, the 72-hour response window, the thing that had been built in the 18 months of human silence and had turned out to be larger and more durable than anyone in the forum had imagined when those 12 chairs were pushed back from the table. I thought about Croft folding his napkin. I thought about the tea growing cold. I thought about the automated response queue and the research ships going dark and the paper in the Journal of Xenobiological Physics and the quiet registration document filed 6 weeks before the walkout. I thought about Platform 12 and Osei's first thought after the barrier went live being to check the maintenance data. I said, yes. As long as we keep doing the work. Shival nodded. She looked at the stars for a while longer. Then she said, good. And we turned and walked back toward the table. Outside the transparent wall, the stars were still and cold and very old. The galactic map on the forum ceiling still pulsed with gold. The barrier held, quietly and without ceremony, in the dark beyond the rim. There was no monument. No ceremony. No special human seat at any table. Just the next item on the agenda, a new signal from a mid-rim system requesting compact assessment, and 42 species sitting in a circle, ready to respond. We did not desert the galaxy. We refused to watch it wait itself to death from the wrong chair. That is the whole of the story. That is all of it. The work continues.